This is Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.
And all of a sudden, everything looks dark and dim and wretched and death-like. And here you move into the Delectable Mountains with the shepherds, and they say, no. That is not the way you think, and that's not the way. That's not the fellowship you have. This is bigger than you, and I think that's kind of the way I look at that idea of the garden imagery there.
Hello and welcome to Theology on the Go. I'm Jonathan Master, joined as always by my friend and co-host James Dolezal. James, how are you today?
I'm doing well. Looking forward to again revisiting the Pilgrim's Progress together.
Yeah, this is always a treat to come back to this wonderful book and to be guided through it by our friend, Dr. Jeff Stivason, who, of course, as our listeners will know, is the pastor of Grace Presbyterian Church in Gibsonia, Pennsylvania, and is a professor of New Testament at Reformed Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Pittsburgh. So, Jeff, thank you for joining us again to guide us through Pilgrim's Progress.
Always good to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Jeff, today we're going to begin with where we left off, which was Doubting Castle. And I want to segue from Doubting Castle by reading a brief passage that Bunyan includes, which he includes as a song. I will not sing it, but perhaps this will help summarize for our listeners where we've come from. Here's what Bunyan writes. This done, they sang as follows. And the this here is Doubting Castle, which is kept by Giant Despair. And they sang this: out of the way we went, and then we found what 'twas to tread upon forbidden ground. And let them that come after have a care, lest heedlessness makes them as we to fare, lest they for trespassing his prisoners are, whose castles doubting and whose names despair. So Jeff, just remind us of what we're coming out of before we get to the next stop on the journey.
Yeah, we're coming out of a desperate spot, really, and I think a spot that probably more Christians today need to give attention to when they read the Pilgrim's Progress, because when you look at the castle, Doubting Castle, you see that this is basically depression, and it can come from any number of places. It's kind of interesting. I don't know if we talked about this in the last episode, but the giant is really a landowner, and one of the landowners obviously put Bunyan in prison, and so the depression can come from any sector: social, economic, political, even religious, and so here you have basically an encounter with depression. And, we learn in that story that, the typical kinds of things that that we attempt to get someone out of anxiety and depression just don't work here. For instance, the two are in this doubting castle, and Christians obviously not experiencing the better part of this, and Hopeful says to him rather, the giant may die, and that's a rational argument, right? And it's a rational argument from Providence, and yet a person trapped in their own anxiety can't hear a rational argument. I mean, it's just so true to life that it's one of those places that it's not, I don't think, taken as seriously by Christians today, but it ought to be, because it reminds us, for instance, that oftentimes getting out of the castle of doubt is being persuaded, and that's what's happened to him here. He's been he's persuaded that the key that he's always had around his neck is going to open any lock in the castle, and that's just one of those things that I think there are so many points here that Christians could really, if they just pondered them, could really find some spiritual value in living their own Christian life.
And Jeff, as you have reminded us over and over again, and I think you spent a lot of time talking about this at the beginning of the book, while this book is written as a kind of account that is sequential, where they move from one stop to the next stop, it's probably best to not think of Bunyan's understanding of the Christian life in that way. So that is to say, Doubting Castle could appear anywhere in the Christian life. And similarly, after Doubting Castle, we come to the Delectable Mountains, which again presented sequentially in Pilgrim's Progress because that's the nature of this book. And yet they too have something to teach Christians at every stage.
Yeah. Yeah. When we were talking just before the recording, we were all talking about how the ecclesiastical appears in the book at various times, which is not meant to be, church is a place where you stop periodically. This is a way of sort of sprinkling it through the Christian life and telling us about the church from different aspects and how it ministers to us. And if we go back, for instance, to the Palace Beautiful, when the porter grants, Christian access to the church, the porter pretty soon disappears. But what happens is three ladies, Prudence, Piety, and Charity, all come to the fore, and they begin to have a conversation with him. And you begin to realize that the porter was the pastor, and these are the congregants. And at that time, I tried to draw a point of analogy to show that like pastor, like people, people like pastor. So the pastor didn't need to be there all the time in order for the congregation to learn the lessons that he teaches from the scriptures and then apply them to people. So here, when we get to the Delectable Mountains, we've got another four figures. And these four figures, unlike what we saw at Palace Beautiful, these four figures, knowledge, experience, watchful, and sincere, all seem to be more along the lines of shepherdly or pastorally men, and so they're called shepherds of the Delectable Mountains. And so what we're getting is another glimpse of the church from the perspective of what it looks like to be under authority and to be talking to men who are pastors.
Jeff, the names of these pastors have, I think, important significance just in terms of sketching a pastoral character for us. Just before we get to them, a brief description of the Delectable Mountains is given when it says, "They went up to the mountains to behold the gardens and orchards, the vineyards, the fountains of water, where also they drank and washed themselves and did freely eat of the vineyards." And then it says, "And then there were on top of those mountains the shepherds." And I think this is a description sort of like Palace Beautiful. Delectable Mountains are a place for being fed and cared for, nourished, and they're coming out of obviously great adversity into this. What is the significance? I'm thinking biblically, even of like Ezekiel's promise in Ezekiel 34, "I will raise up for them a garden of renown, and they shall no longer be consumed with hunger in the land." There's this picture of a place of provision. Why, in other words, what's the significance of the church, I think, being described that way? Is the church a fruitful garden where there are good things to eat?
Yeah, it's an interesting point of departure when you think about the church described in this way, because I think about two stories and I juxtapose them. I think about one, Balaam prophesying against Israel in the Old Testament, and the Lord putting words into his mouth, and Balaam is supposed to be cursing, but he's blessing. And in one of those places, I think it's Numbers 23, I think, where he begins to bless Israel, and he speaks of them as a beautiful valley, as a rich garden, and I've always thought of that in terms of how does Israel actually look in comparison to how God sees them and describes them through this false prophet's mouth. And what a contrast, God sees his people through his beloved, and we oftentimes don't do that. But setting that aside, I was reminded. I heard John Piper speak one time, and he was talking about Einstein. And apparently, Einstein at one point said that um, I would rather I would rather look through my telescope and see the glory of God, because when I go to church and hear about the glory of God from behind the pulpit, it pales in comparison to what I see in the telescope. And I thought to myself, it surely does take eyes to see the riches, the beautiful, the lush, the rich garden that the church is, the kingdom of God in the world. But that and it takes the eyes of Christ to see it. But I think that's kind of what we have here is that these guys are going to where the pulpit proclaims the glory of God in the church, and they see it that way. They see these things as they are. And when you see them as they are, it's kind of like when you hold the doubting castle in tension with the Delectable Mountains. I mean, remember, remember doubting castle. He says the grave is easier. It's in the world and it's in despair where the grave seems easier. But before, when you had eyes to see, the grave was the worst place in the world. You thought, I'm going to go down to the grave if I don't get out. And
Yeah.
you need the
Life,
grace.
eternal life. I mean, that's how he
Yeah.
starts out.
And so despair has this way of eliminating fellowship. And I
Mm.
think that's what we saw in Doubted Castle. Once it eliminates fellowship, you only hear your own voice or the voices of the demons that whisper in your ear. And then what begins to happen is this terrible voice empathizes with you and you with it, and all of a sudden everything looks dark and dim and wretched and death-like. And here you move into the Delectable Mountains with the shepherds, and they say, no, 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 that is not the way you think, and that's not the fellowship you have. This is bigger than you. I think that's kind of the way I look at that idea of the garden imagery there.
Mm. So let's talk about the shepherds. Or Jonathan, you wanted to.
Well, that's exactly where I wanted to go. I wanted to ask about the shepherds because we've looked at pastoral figures earlier in this book, and you've made a number of comments about what they teach us regarding pastoral ministry. And the one description that you've keyed in on that as I recall is not a description given of these shepherds is in the past we've seen pastoral figures be very grave, and by that is meant a kind of solemnity, a seriousness, a sobriety, because they're dealing with serious things, they're dealing with eternal things. These shepherds are not given that description. However, you could say that they exemplify those qualities. But I suppose what I want to ask is, what do these shepherds teach us about the nature of pastoral ministry? What angle do they come at it with that may be different from what we've seen earlier in the book?
Yeah. Well, I think you're right. I think there is a difference. I think there's a similarity that Bunyan sort of drops in that is kind of striking. If you were to go back to that, the House of Interpreter, and you see the picture on the wall, and the interpreter, who I see as not the spirit. Remember, I argued at that time, I see him as a pastor. He shows the picture of the pastor on the wall, and that's the whole grave look to him, the world behind him, and all that. And the interesting thing he does is he takes him by the hand and he leads him from one lesson to the next. And here, notice this: all four of these took them by the hand, and I just think that's a little clue that he drops to say, these are the guides, these are the shepherd guides that are leading you through the Christian life. And yeah, you're right. It's one of those things where it's a very similar thing, but it's different. They're providing a different glimpse um, into what a pastor does in the life of a person, and So you have knowledge, experience, watchful, sincere. Did you guys want to take those names? Is that what you were asking, Jonathan, about
Well,
taking
that
those
might be
names?
helpful. Yeah. I mean, I had not noticed that took them by the hand. Uh,
Even that next line, took them into their tents, given to
Yeah,
hospitality. You can
yeah,
really see how that's coming through.
yeah,
Yeah, maybe it would be helpful, Jeff, to kind of go through one by one, because again, what I'm getting at is more, if we're to see a picture here of the church and the great blessing of being a part of the church, a big part of that is the pastoral oversight and care that you
yeah.
receive as a Christian, and that's what's emphasized here. But it's a little different, although as you pointed out, there are some similarities that I hadn't noticed. So what do they do? What do these good shepherds do?
Yeah, I think the names and the order of the names are oftentimes interesting. I think that we often talk about experiential Calvinism, but you know, I mean, if you read Bunyan here, he's talking about cognitive Calvinism that comes first, right? He's talking about knowledge that leads to right experience. And you know, um and that and that's worth guarding, and so being watchful and sincere. uh I think the flow of names, first of all, is kind of striking when you think about it. But what do they do? The first thing they do is they take them to the hill called error. And I think that's really interesting, because I don't, you guys might have to help me with the reference to this, but I remember reading in John Murray once where he said that the difference between truth and error is a razor's edge. And uh and it, it strikes me as really fascinating that the very the kind of that the place that they take them to is you know a hill called error. um, it doesn't seem to me, when you think about, the way that we might do things today, it doesn't seem to me that, like, if we were trying to win friends and influence people, it doesn't seem to me that taking them to the hill of error would be the first stop on the tour.
Right.
you
Right.
know, but that's what he does.
Yeah, I think he even points to doctrinal error that actually makes shipwreck of the faith, and because Christian and hopeful say, what does this mean? Why are you showing us this sort of steep ravine where men fall off the mountain of error into this sort of pit? And they mention Hymenaeus and Philetus concerning the faith of the resurrection of the body. I mean, something fundamental to Christianity, that the fundamentals of the faith were not really grasped or held fast, and that those who enter the church but who don't really commit themselves to its fundamental doctrine will in fact fall and stumble. And that the error, I guess the error here is there. It's not like there's error without casualty. It's not an innocent mistake. It's the kind of error that actually ruins a person.
Yeah, and you kind of you wonder about why people do the things they do, right? And I'm thinking about pastors and theologians, and sometimes don't you wonder if certain theologians are just trying to get as close as they can to the razor's edge, so that there can be some innovation in their teaching, a little bit different, kind of disregarding Charles Hodge, there's nothing new that ever came out of the seminary kind of posture, and saying, you know what, that's a little boring, and we need a little something to spice life up. And so let's just walk the razor's edge as close as we can, and and appear kind of innovative and sexy. And yet, I think that, Bunyan is saying that's probably true in every age. And Bunyan, I think, is saying, you want to really, error is real. And all you have to do is, I think, the more scholarly and scholastic the ladder you climb, the sort of the less error comes into conversation, right? It's all about nuance at that point, and it's all about, well, he's just got a different way of seeing, a different hermeneutic, a different method, this, that, and the other. And it's like, no, at some level, at some point, error is error. And and I appreciated. I went to ETS one year, and they had a big panel about the eternal subordination of the Son stuff that was going on. This was a few years ago, and I remember, I think it was Kevin Giles stood up there, and I remember him looking at the other panelists and who held the eternal subordination and saying, "Hey, look, guys, I don't know if you realize this or not, but like that was heresy back in the early church, and we're unwilling to call it that, and so I appreciated that because without getting into the discussion, I thought to myself, I can appreciate a guy who, in the context of an academic society, is willing to still say that's an error, and that's a dangerous one.
Yeah. Those in the narrative, Bunyan has those that fell off of Mount Ayr to their doom. The casualties actually lay there unburied. This is interesting. They're kind of exposed, and they're there as a sign of warning to the rest of us. And Bunyan says, for an example for others to take heed, how they clamber too high, or how they come too near the brink of this mountain. And that's that daring, innovative tendency that isn't content with sort of the richness of orthodoxy, but has to find that new and novel thing that no one's ever seen before. And this is not to say that we don't study to show ourselves approved, and that in any generation someone may see riches in Holy Scripture that were not quite glimpsed by those
Amen.
before. Certainly we want to, the Spirit works and teaches through his word, and one generation may see what another did not see before it. But that's not what Bunyan's talking about here.
Yeah. No. I mean, good exegesis, and the application of things like the analogy of Scripture, or good and necessary consequence, to name two of the most fundamental, and then to build out from there a wonderful hermeneutic that continues to unfold the riches that are in Scripture, is not what you're right. Not what he's talking about. Absolutely not. But
He goes to
tell you,
another mountain after this. Well,
yeah,
I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
No, go ahead.
I was going to
wanted
sort of
go
set
to-
us off to there's Mount Ayr, then Mount Caution.
Yeah.
But I wanted to ask how that might function a little differently.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? These guys are walking in the midst of the tombs and the blind, and they can't see to get themselves out of there. And and you know, I don't, I mean, at this point, you're just kind of you're letting your mind go a bit in terms of where we just went, in terms of that previous mountain, and now, and you think to yourself, I wonder if we're still thinking about error, and we're thinking about um you know what is it to get caught up in the midst of the blind and not be able to get out. And I this may or may not be what he's talking about, but when I read this, I think of a story by George Eldon Ladd. I can't remember the author, but it's published by, I think, Oxford Press, and it was called A Place at the Table. And Ladd was so consumed with having a voice in liberal theology. And I remember in this reading that his book, his magnum opus, about the kingdom, which was going to be the crossover book from evangelicalism to liberalism, and he was going to have a place at the table, was reviewed poorly by a liberal, and it just crushed him. I mean, crushed his world. And like, you can read about how it crushed him in that book if you'd like, but it just devastated him. And the guy that wrote it didn't even remember writing the review. And but Ladd strikes me as that guy that's wandering around in the midst of the blind and just can't see his way out. It's like, no, there's, have some caution, brother. there is light, right? And that light is afforded in the word, not in seeking a place at the table amongst those who would, you know, who would appear to be heady or, kind of innovative and that sort of thing.
Yeah, but I mean, Bunyan has a pretty strong indictment. He says, he that wandereth out of the way of understanding shall remain in the congregation of the dead.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's the caution.
Yeah.
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 Jeff, we're nearing the end of our time, but what I found striking about this passage, this whole section, is that what these pastors do primarily in their, if you will, discipleship or their ministry to the pilgrims is they show them, they warn them,
Yeah.
they show them some ways that are obvious and some ways that are very subtle, in which they can be left off the path. And I think, returning to one of your points that you made earlier, I think it is notable that probably our pastoral practice today contains less warning than certainly the New Testament does, and that Bunyan saw as necessary. It's a reminder, I think, to pastors, but also a reminder to people sitting under pastoral care. That's what we need. We need someone who not only teaches us the truth and shows us the glories of the gospel of grace, but who will also warn us in no uncertain terms about subtle ways and significant ways in which we can be led. And we're so resistant to that, often offended by it or feel as if it's condescending or something, but absolutely necessary.
Yeah. No, I 100% agree with you. I try to observe the Directory of Public Worship statement that we shouldn't drag out sort of the people that have fallen off Mount Error just to drag them out and parade them around the congregation, for no purpose, right? Don't drag out the Arians if there are no Arians in your congregation, right? You bring those to the front to your congregation if they need to be warned, and then you warn them thoroughly, and then you put them away. That kind of thing, and you can. There's the guy that wants to pull out every error every time he preaches, and then there's the guy that doesn't want to pull out any errors and doesn't want to warn anyone. And this is, like you said, a very good admonition for us to be careful to warn people about error, not just about theological errors, about the dead bodies that lay at the base of the mountain, but just, like there's an enchanted ground, and if you lay on it, you're going to be in trouble. Like, or, when I think about wanton professor, I think about you think about the seductive woman in Proverbs 6, and just think about her as the lure to a place at the table instead of the woman that's going to lure you away from your wife. Think about her as sort of the person who's summoning you to the table. Like, those are the kinds of things I think that are wonderful warnings for us that we need to take heed of, and it's good reminder.
Well, Jeff, as always, thanks for joining us. I know your voice was not in tip-top shape, but nonetheless, I think you conveyed a lot of things that were very helpful. And since I am still in a poetic mood, I will end with the song that this section ends with. It begins with a song and ends with a song. And
Sing it, brother.
Here's how it goes. Thus by the shepherd's secrets are revealed, which from all other men are kept concealed. Come to the shepherds then, if you would see things deep, things hid, and that mysterious be.
Wonderful.
As always, we're grateful for you, our listeners. If you are able to recommend this, if you think someone else would benefit from this podcast or this episode, please pass it along. If you can rate and review Theology on the Go, we'd encourage you to do that. That helps us spread the word. And if you are able to donate, we can only do this because of supporters like you. You can click the donate button at the top of placefortruth.org or alliancenet.org. And at alliancenet.org, you can also get a number of other resources, both written resources and audio resources. Thank you, as always, for listening to Theology on the Go, a brief interview about an eternal truth.